The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above the courthouse hallway, a sterile brightness that seemed to drain color from everything beneath them. 7-year-old Emma sat on a mahogany bench that had seen countless nervous witnesses before her, yet somehow never seemed to wear from their anxiety. Her small legs dangled several inches above the polished floor, white patent leather shoes that her mother had insisted on, as if proper footwear could somehow protect her from what was coming. Her pigtails, painstakingly braided that morning, had begun to slip from their elastic bands, escaping in wispy strands that framed her pale, drawn face. In her lap, Emma clutched Mr. Whiskers with a death grip that would have made even the stuffed rabbit's fabric creator wince. The little cotton rabbit had been her companion since her 4th birthday, a gift from her grandmother before the stroke that had left the elderly woman in a nursing home. Mr. Whiskers had button eyes, black and glassy, and Emma had positioned him so they stared straight ahead, as if he too was preparing for something momentous. His button eyes had nearly popped off 3 times already during her nervous fidgeting, and her mother had threatened to sew them back on so many times that Emma now held him with exaggerated care, understanding at some deep level that losing Mr. Whiskers today would be a catastrophe she couldn't survive. 6 months. It had been 6 months since the night that fractured Emma's world into before and after. 6 months since she'd accidentally witnessed something in her neighbor's garage that no 7-year-old should ever see. 6 months since Mr. Robert, who everyone called Uncle Bobby, who brought cookies to their 4th of July barbecues and helped her father fix the fence, had revealed himself as something else entirely. Something dark. Something that didn't match the friendly waves and the easy smile. The memories tried to surface, the way they always did when she sat too long with her thoughts, but Emma had learned to push them down into the deepest part of herself, a place she wouldn't allow them to breathe. It was exhausting work, this constant suppression, this invisible dam she maintained against a flood of images and sounds and sensations she couldn't process. Her 7-year-old mind wasn't equipped with the machinery to make sense of what she'd witnessed, so instead, she simply locked it away and threw away the key. Her voice had followed those memories into silence. 30 words. That's all she had spoken in the past 184 days. Her mother had kept count, writing them down in a small notebook as if tallying them might somehow make her daughter's voice seem less precious, less significant. There had been a day when Emma said, "I love you" to her mother. That was 4 words right there, spoken like they cost her physical pain. Another day, she'd asked for juice at dinner, 2 words, her voice so quiet that her father had to ask her to repeat herself. Single words mostly. Yes, no, okay, hungry, tired. A vocabulary of survival stripped down to its bare necessities. The doctors called it selective mutism, a condition born from severe psychological trauma. Dr. Reeves, the child psychologist, had used gentle words and kind eyes, but Emma understood the subtext. Her voice had left her. Whether it would return remained the great unknown. Her mother sat beside her now, one hand on Emma's shoulder, not pressing, just present. Was a woman who had once been vibrant and loud, a kindergarten teacher who sang songs and told jokes and filled rooms with warmth. But watching her daughter disappear into silence had stolen something from her as well. The permanent worry lines around her eyes had deepened. Her hair, once kept in a perfect bob, now showed gray roots she didn't have time to color. She'd taken a leave of absence from teaching because Emma needed her to be here, in this hallway, at this moment, preparing her daughter for something that felt monumentally unfair. "You're going to be so brave today," whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She said things like this often, small encouragements that Emma understood were less about Emma's future bravery and more about her mother's desperate wish for it. Emma didn't respond. She never responded to encouragement anymore. She just looked at her mother with eyes that had aged 10 years in 6 months and turned back to staring at the courtroom doors. The hallway itself was a theater of human emotion. Attorneys in expensive suits rushed past, speaking in urgent tones about depositions and motions and plea bargains, language that sounded like a foreign dialect to Emma. Witnesses for other cases sat scattered on benches, some nervous, some angry, some looking through the hallway without really seeing it. An elderly man chewed gum with aggressive intensity. A young woman scrolled through her phone with such fierce concentration that Emma wondered if she was hiding from her own reality, the way Emma had learned to hide from hers. Somewhere in this building, Uncle Bobby was also waiting, maybe with his own lawyer who would try to convince a courtroom that what Emma saw wasn't really what she saw, that perhaps she'd imagined it or misunderstood it. Emma understood this on some level. She wasn't stupid. She knew that her testimony, her voice, would become a weapon in a war between truth and denial, and people didn't like weapons turned against them. They fought back. The defense attorney had already been described to her in careful terms by the prosecutor. He might ask you difficult questions, the prosecutor had explained during preparation. He might try to make you doubt what you remember. That's his job. But your job is just to tell the truth. Emma had nodded, but inside she felt her stomach twist into shapes that hurt. She was supposed to speak today. In front of a judge, in front of a jury, in front of the man who had shattered her world. She was supposed to find words and make them march out of her mouth like soldiers into battle. The very idea made her throat close up, made her chest tighten with panic so profound it felt like drowning in air. Mr. Whisker's button eyes stared ahead. Emma stared ahead. They waited together. And somewhere in the building, the day was creeping closer to noon, to the moment when all of this would begin, when Emma would finally have to choose between her silence and her survival. Everything hinged on this moment. Everything was about to change. The hallway had fallen into a strange, pregnant silence, that peculiar quiet that precedes something significant, when the universe itself seems to pause and hold its breath. Emma's mother had excused herself 10 minutes earlier to use the restroom, leaving Emma alone on the mahogany bench with Mr. Whiskers and her racing thoughts. The child sat in that peculiar way traumatized children do, perfectly still, as if movement might draw unwanted attention, might invite questions she couldn't answer. That's when Emma heard it, the distinctive click-click-click of nails against the polished courthouse floor. Her head lifted slowly, driven by something deeper than curiosity, an instinct older than her trauma, more primal than her fear. The sound grew closer, accompanied by the steady, purposeful footsteps of someone in authority. Emma's muscles tensed. Were they coming for her? Was it time? Her throat constricted with renewed panic until she saw them round the corner. Officer Martinez was a man in his mid-40s with kind brown eyes creased at the corners from years of smiling. His police uniform was immaculate, every button polished to a mirror shine, his badge catching the fluorescent light with official authority. But it wasn't Officer Martinez who commanded Emma's complete attention. It was the creature beside him. The German Shepherd was magnificent, a symphony of golden tan and deep black fur, with a muscular build that spoke of discipline and purpose. But what struck Emma most was the dog's demeanor. He wasn't pulling against the leash or straining with barely contained energy, the way police dogs were portrayed in movies and television shows. Instead, Max padded beside his handler with a calm, almost meditative grace, his intelligent amber eyes observing the hallway with serene awareness. His ears stood alert but not aggressive. His tail hung loose and easy. Everything about him communicated controlled power and steady presence. Officer Martinez was making his way toward the courtroom when his eyes caught Emma sitting alone on the bench. He paused, considering her for just a moment, the small girl clutching a stuffed rabbit with white-knuckled intensity, the pallor of her skin, the haunted quality in her expression that no 7-year-old should carry. The officer's expression shifted into something more purposeful. He'd read Emma's file. He'd studied the details of the case, the nature of her trauma, the fact that she'd been rendered nearly mute by psychological shock. The prosecutor had submitted a formal request 3 weeks ago, something that had struck many of Officer Martinez's colleagues as highly unusual. The request had detailed Emma's condition, and asked if the department's trauma support animal program might be employed to help this particular witness. Officer Martinez had been the unanimous choice to bring Max. Max wasn't a standard police dog. While he was certainly capable of the protection and detection work that most K-9 units performed, his primary training had been specialized and expensive. Over 18 months, Max had been conditioned through careful, humane protocols to recognize signs of human distress and respond with comfort rather than action. He'd been trained by trauma specialists and animal behaviorists who understood that sometimes the greatest service a dog could provide wasn't catching criminals, it was healing broken souls. "Hello there," Officer Martinez said softly, his voice carefully modulated to non-threatening tones. He kept his distance, understanding that approach could feel like aggression to a frightened child. "I'm Officer Martinez. This is Max." Max's head turned toward Emma with fluid grace, and their eyes met across the 15 feet of hallway that separated them. The dog's gaze was extraordinary, not the blank stare of an animal, but something more, something that seemed to contain understanding and compassion. Emma's grip on Mr. Whiskers loosened almost imperceptibly. "Max is a special dog," Officer Martinez continued, his tone conversational and gentle. "He works with people who are going through difficult times. Would you like to say hello to him?" Emma's tongue felt swollen in her mouth, her throat impossibly tight. The muscles around her vocal cords, so long unused for anything beyond single words, felt atrophied and fragile. But something about Max's steady presence made her want to try. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Can I pet him?" The words emerged like the creaking of old hinges, barely audible, but they emerged nonetheless. Returning from the restroom with perfect timing, froze mid-step, her hand covering her mouth. She'd heard her daughter speak, multiple words, in sequence. Officer Martinez smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had witnessed small miracles before and would witness them again. "Max would love that very much. He's waiting for you." The officer knelt beside Emma, his movement slow and unthreatening, reducing his physical height to something less overwhelming. Max followed, dropping into a perfect sit beside his handler, his entire body a study in controlled calm. Up close, Emma could see the details she'd missed from a distance. The slight silvering around Max's muzzle indicating his age and experience, the musculature beneath his fur that spoke of training and discipline, and most importantly, his eyes, warm brown irises that held something that felt like recognition. "Go ahead," Officer Martinez encouraged. "Max loves to meet new friends." Emma's hand moved forward like it belonged to someone else, trembling slightly. Her fingers made contact with Max's fur, and the sensation was unexpected, not aggressive or bristling, but soft, warm, incredibly gentle. The dog's coat was thicker than she'd anticipated, with an undercoat that created subtle layers beneath her palm. Max didn't move away or pull, but instead leaned slightly into her touch, as if welcoming her completely. "He's very smart," Officer Martinez explained, watching as Emma continued to stroke the dog's shoulder. "He can tell when people are scared or sad, and he likes to help them feel better." As if to demonstrate this point, Max shifted his weight and gently pressed his large head against Emma's leg, a gesture so tender and deliberate that it nearly broke her mother's heart standing there witnessing it. Emma looked down at the dog's massive head resting against her knee, and for the first time in 6 months, something shifted inside her. Not a complete healing, not even close, but a small crack in the wall she'd built around her trauma. "What's his name?" Emma whispered, though the officer had already told her. "Max," Officer Martinez said, "and he's going to be with you today if that's okay. During everything that happens in the courtroom, he'll be right beside you no matter what." Emma stroked Max's fur, and in that moment, something extraordinary began. The slow, tentative reconstruction of a child's broken faith in the world. Officer Martinez understood he was witnessing the beginning of Emma's healing, and he simply let it unfold, knowing that sometimes the greatest courtroom victories weren't about winning cases. They were about winning back a child's voice. The minutes that followed Emma's first multi-word statement in 6 months seemed to stretch and expand, taking on a quality almost outside of time. Officer Martinez had tactfully excused himself, acknowledging with professional insight that Emma needed space to experience this moment without the weight of adult observation. He positioned himself across the hallway, pretending to review case files on his tablet while remaining peripherally aware of everything unfolding between the child and his dog. Emma's mother approached slowly, not with the desperate eagerness of a parent desperate to fix everything, but with the careful restraint of someone who understood that this fragile moment could shatter under too much pressure. She knelt beside the bench, her movements deliberate and gentle, and sat close enough to be present but not so close as to intrude on the space Emma was sharing with Max. "Is it okay if I sit here?" asked softly. Emma nodded, the first gesture of permission she'd given her mother in months. Mr. Whiskers remained cradled in her lap, but one hand was free now, still stroking Max's soft fur with an almost meditative quality. The dog had shifted slightly, positioning his large body against Emma's leg in a way that created a protective cocoon, not claustrophobic but encompassing, containing, safe. Max's warmth radiated through Emma's thin cotton dress. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, a rhythm that seemed to anchor her to something solid in a world that had become terrifyingly unstable. The dog's breathing was deep and calm, almost hypnotic in its rhythm. With each exhale, she felt his muscles relax fractionally, and she found herself matching her own breathing to his, a synchronization that happened without conscious thought. "You can talk to Max, honey," said quietly, testing the waters. "If you want to, he's a very good listener." Emma turned to look at her mother, and saw something in her daughter's eyes that hadn't been present in months, the faintest spark of something that might have been hope, or at least its distant cousin. The child looked back at Max, and then, as if making an enormous internal decision, she leaned closer to the dog's ear. "Hi, Max," she whispered, her voice so soft that I had to strain to hear it. "My name is Emma." It was such a simple thing, such an ordinary introduction, yet felt tears spring to her eyes. Her daughter was speaking, not to her, not to the therapist, but to this extraordinary animal who seemed to understand something about Emma's fractured psyche that adults could not. Max's ear flicked slightly in response to Emma's voice. His tail, which had been resting quietly against the floor, gave a single, measured thump. The dog's head remained perfectly still, maintaining the exact distance between them, as if he understood that any sudden movement might startle her back into silence. "I have a dog at home," Emma continued, her whispers growing slightly louder, more confident. "Her name is Princess, but I haven't been able to play with her much because—" She trailed off, the words catching on something sharp inside her. Max pressed his head against her leg with gentle insistence, a gesture that seemed to say, "It's okay, I'm here, keep going." "Because I've been scared all the time," Emma finished, the admission escaping like air from a slowly deflating balloon. "I didn't want to talk to anyone, not Mommy, not my teacher, not even Princess. I just wanted to hide." Reached over and gently placed her hand on her daughter's shoulder, not gripping, just touching, just being there. Emma didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned slightly into her mother's touch while maintaining her focus on Max. The hallway seemed to have become its own small universe, separate from the official business of the courthouse. Other people passed, lawyers with briefcases, witnesses summoned for other cases, bailiffs in their uniforms, but they moved through this space without disturbing it, as if they recognized they were witnessing something sacred. "I like your eyes," Emma whispered to Max, reaching up to gently touch the area around one of his amber irises. "They're nice eyes, they don't look scary, they look like they understand things." Officer Martinez, observing from across the hallway, made a small note on his tablet. He documented hundreds of these interactions over his 5 years running the trauma support program, and they never failed to move him. This was the healing power that so many in the legal system missed, the understanding that sometimes what trauma survivors needed wasn't more interrogation or pressure, but a moment of genuine connection with something pure and non-judgmental. "My teacher says I was very brave to tell what I saw," Emma continued, her whispers becoming a steady stream now, words that had been up for months suddenly finding release. "But I don't feel brave. I feel scared. All the time. I have bad dreams. I wake up and my heart goes really fast. Mommy has to come sleep in my room sometimes." Max shifted his weight, and his entire body leaned more fully against Emma's leg, a physical declaration of solidarity, of presence, of refusal to let this child sit alone in her fear. "But you're not scared right now," Emma said, not asking, stating it as fact. She looked at Max with eyes that were beginning to clear, the fog of trauma lifting just enough to see through. "You're not scared of anything, are you, Max? You're strong, and you're not alone. You have Officer Martinez, and I have you, right now, I have you." His hand on her daughter's shoulder trembled slightly, and she bit her lip to keep from sobbing. This was it. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, not a complete recovery, not the erasure of trauma, but a child beginning to understand that she could survive it, that she didn't have to face it alone. "I think I can do it," Emma whispered to Max, her voice barely audible but filled with something that sounded almost like determination. "I think I can go in there and tell everyone what I saw, because you're going to be with me, right?" Max's tail thumped again, and his eyes seemed to hold infinite wisdom, the ancient knowing of a dog who had been trained to recognize the exact moment when a broken soul began to heal. "You can do this," Officer Martinez said gently from across the hallway, giving voice to what Max had been communicating all along. "Emma, you can absolutely do this." Emma took a deep breath, the first full, complete breath she'd taken in 6 months, and squeezed Mr. Whiskers one final time. She was ready, not because she was no longer afraid, but because she was no longer afraid alone. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 7 loomed before them like the entrance to another dimension. They were massive, carved with intricate geometric patterns that spoke of 19th century craftsmanship and institutional gravitas. Each door was fitted with polished brass handles that reflected the hallway lights with mirror-like precision. Behind those doors lay everything Emma had been preparing for, everything she'd feared, and everything she'd begun to hope for with Max's steady presence beside her. Officer Martinez stood just inside the courtroom, positioned to hold the door open. He'd requested that Emma be allowed to walk in with Max, and Judge Harrison, after careful consideration of precedent, legal protocol, and ultimately, the welfare of a traumatized child, had approved the unconventional arrangement in writing. Still, despite the judge's blessing, everyone understood this was revolutionary, that they were stepping into territory the legal system rarely ventured into. Emma's hand gripped Max's leash with white-knuckled intensity, but her other hand remained buried in his fur, drawing strength from his steady presence. Officer Martinez had coached her on the walk down the hallway. "Just keep moving forward. Don't look at anyone. Keep your eyes on me, and Max will help you get there." Placed a kiss on her daughter's forehead. "I'll be right there in the gallery, watching every second. You've got this, baby." Emma nodded, her throat dry, her pulse hammering in her small chest. She could feel Max's calmness flowing into her like electricity through copper wire, a physical grounding that made it possible to move forward, one foot in front of the other. That's all she had to do. The doors swung open. The courtroom was larger than Emma had imagined, a cavernous space designed to intimidate, to remind every person who entered that they were stepping into the domain of law and order and official accountability. The walls were paneled in dark wood. The lighting was bright but clinical. The gallery, public seating area, held perhaps 30 people, reporters with notepads and cameras, curious members of the community, and somewhere in this sea of eyes, her mother. But it was the reaction to Max that made everything else fade to background noise. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Cameras began snapping. Whispers erupted like a swarm of bees. The lead defense attorney, David, a man known for his aggressive tactics and his complete lack of sympathy for vulnerable witnesses, jerked to his feet so violently his chair scraped backward with a screech that made several spectators flinch. "Your Honor's voice boomed through the courtroom, his face flushing with indignation. "This is completely unprecedented. I move to have this animal removed immediately. This is clearly an attempt to bias the jury, to manipulate their emotions." "Counsel," Judge Harrison's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. She was a woman in her late 60s, gray-haired and stern-faced, with 32 years of judicial experience written in every line of her expression. She did not raise her voice, did not need to. The entire room snapped to attention. "I am aware of what you're about to say. I approved this arrangement on the record 3 weeks ago. The request was submitted by the prosecution, reviewed by my staff, and deemed appropriate under the specific circumstances of this case. The animal remains." Emma felt the tension vibrate through the courtroom, the power dynamic shifting in ways she was too young to fully understand but old enough to sense. His jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists before he consciously relaxed them. "Proceed," Judge Harrison commanded, turning her attention to Emma with an expression that seemed to shift subtly. There was still authority there, still judicial distance, but there was also something else, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, of what this moment represented. Officer Martinez led Emma forward, through the gate that separated the gallery from the official spaces, past the prosecution table where sat with an expression of quiet validation, past the defense table where Mr. Roberts sat in his expensive suit, his face a mask of polite concern that made Emma's stomach turn. She kept her eyes forward, fixed on Officer Martinez, on the witness stand that loomed ahead like a small island in a vast sea. The jury, 12 ordinary people who had been carefully selected over 2 days of dire, watched Emma's progression with visible emotion. This was not what they'd expected. This was not standard courtroom procedure. But they were human beings, and what they were witnessing was a small child moving toward a moment of enormous courage, and that transcended legal protocol. Max moved with perfect precision, his training evident in every step. His head was up but not aggressive. His pace matched Emma's exactly, neither pulling nor lagging. To anyone observing, it would have been impossible to say whether Emma was leading Max or Max was leading Emma. They were a unit, a team, two broken things finding strength through connection. The bailiff, an older man named Tom who'd worked this courthouse for 23 years, stepped forward with obvious uncertainty. "Your Honor, where should the animal sit?" Judge Harrison glanced at Officer Martinez, who smoothly responded, "He'll position himself beside the witness stand, Your Honor. He's trained to remain motionless and silent during testimony." There was a moment of profound silence in the courtroom. Everyone seemed to be holding their collective breath, waiting to see if the judge would allow this final, crucial element of Emma's support system. Judge Harrison's eyes moved from Officer Martinez to Emma to the dog, and something in her expression softened, just barely, but perceptibly. "That's acceptable," she ruled. "But I want it understood by everyone present that this is a special accommodation made in this specific case due to the nature of the witness's trauma and the psychological expert testimony we've received. This does not set precedent for future cases. Is that clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," various voices responded in unison. Emma climbed the 3 steps to the witness stand, Max ascending beside her with the grace of an animal born for this moment. The Bible that would typically be used for swearing sat on the clerk's desk, but Officer Martinez had already informed the judge that Emma would affirm rather than swear, given her communication limitations. Judge Harrison had agreed without hesitation. "Do you solemnly affirm that the testimony you are about to give in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" the clerk intoned. Emma nodded, then caught Judge Harrison's look and whispered, Yes. The word hung in the courtroom air like something sacred. Max settled into a perfect down position beside the witness stand, his head resting on his front paws, his eyes half closing in what appeared to be complete relaxation. But Officer Martinez knew the truth. Every muscle in the dog's body remained alert, ready to respond to any sign of distress from Emma. Max was fully present, fully attentive, even in his apparent rest. David stood, straightening his expensive tie, preparing his attack. He looked at the small child in the witness stand, at the large dog beside her, at the jury members whose faces were already showing sympathy, and Emma could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. How to work around this obstacle? How to discredit a child who now had the most powerful ally in the room? But he'd already lost something crucial, though he might not have realized it yet. He'd lost the narrative of this being a frightened, vulnerable child alone against the system. Emma was no longer alone. And everything that came next would be different because of it. The first few questions came from the prosecution. A woman in her early 50s with steely competence and a genuine commitment to protecting vulnerable witnesses. She kept her voice soft, her questions gentle, scaffolding Emma toward comfort with her own voice. "Can you tell me your full name, please?" "Emma Rose," Emma whispered, her fingers finding Max's ear and stroking it gently. The dog's eyes opened slightly, acknowledging the contact, then closed again. But his tail thumped once against the floor, a gesture that somehow communicated to everyone in the courtroom, "She's doing great. Keep going." "And how old are you, Emma?" 7 years old. I'll be 8 in March." The jurors leaned forward imperceptibly. This was not the traumatized, mute child they'd read about in the case summary. This was a child who could speak, who was speaking, though her voice required everyone to strain slightly to hear. Continued through the preliminary questions, establishing Emma's presence on the evening in question, her relationship to the neighborhood, the ordinary details that built foundation and credibility. Emma answered each one clearly, her confidence growing with each successful completion. Max remained her anchor, a physical and psychological tether to safety. Then David stood. His strategy became immediately apparent, overwhelmed through volume, confused through rapid-fire questioning, intimidate through aggressive prosecutorial tactics honed over 30 years of courtroom battles. He didn't start with the major allegations. He started with small details, fishing for inconsistencies. "You say you were in the garage at 6:47 p.m., but isn't it true you'd been playing outside until after 7 o'clock on most evenings that week?" Emma's small frame stiffened. Max's eyes opened fully, his head lifting slightly, as if the dog could sense the shift in the courtroom's emotional temperature. I came inside early that day," Emma said, her voice becoming even quieter. "But you're not completely sure, are you?" pressed, moving closer to the witness stand. "You're 7 years old. You don't wear a watch. You might have been confused about the time. Isn't that possible?" Emma's hands trembled. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Max stood. It was a subtle movement, not dramatic or intrusive, but absolute in its assertion. The dog pressed against the side of the witness stand, his large body creating a physical barrier between Emma and the defense attorney. His head remained at Emma's level, and he turned those intelligent amber eyes toward with an expression that somehow conveyed both calm and complete intolerance for this line of assault. Judge Harrison's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. She was watching to see if Max's intervention was supportive or if it had crossed into interference. Emma took a deep breath, drawing strength from Max's steadfast presence. "I remember because my mother called me inside to help with dinner. She always does that around 6:45. I was doing my homework when I heard sounds from the garage next door. I went to my window. That's when I saw Mr. Robert." Her voice had grown stronger, still quiet, but infused with something that sounded like truth, like certainty, like the unshakable memory of a child who had been trying to forget but hadn't been able to. Alleged sounds, corrected sharply. You don't actually know what you heard, do you? It could have been anything: construction equipment, a neighbor working on a project. It was screaming, Emma interrupted, the words tumbling out now with a clarity that seemed to shock everyone, including the child herself. A girl was screaming, and I heard Mr. Robert telling her to be quiet. And then I saw him pushing someone into the back of his van. The courtroom had gone completely silent. The sound of pen on paper stopped. The sound of breathing seemed suspended. Even mid-stride back toward his table had frozen. I know what I saw, Emma continued, her voice gaining volume and conviction with each word. I saw his face. I saw what he was doing. I've seen it every single night in my dreams for 6 months. I close my eyes and I see it. I wake up screaming and my mommy comes in and holds me. Judge Harrison's expression had shifted. Her jaw had tightened. Her hands, which had been folded on the bench before her, were now gripping the edge. And there, unmistakably, was moisture glistening in her eyes. She blinked, trying to clear it, but the tears had already begun to form. Recovered, his jaw clenching. You're a confused child making accusations based on. I'm not confused, Emma said with the certainty of someone who had finally found her voice and refused to surrender it. I know exactly what I saw. I've been trying not to remember because it's horrible and scary, but I remember. Every day I remember. I remember his shirt was blue. I remember the van was white. I remember the girl had red sneakers. I remember he was smiling like it was funny. Max settled back down beside the witness stand, but he kept his head raised, his gaze fixed on Emma with what could only be described as pride. Officer Martinez, standing at the back of the courtroom, allowed himself the smallest smile of validation. The jury members were visibly moved. Several had expressions of concentrated empathy. One woman had covered her mouth with her hand. The foreman, a middle-aged man who'd introduced himself as a father of 2 daughters, was staring at Emma with an expression of fierce protection. Judge Harrison removed her reading glasses and pressed her fingers to her eyes. When she removed them, tears had left visible trails down her cheeks. She didn't apologize for the emotional display. She simply replaced her glasses and looked directly at Emma with an expression that conveyed something beyond judicial authority. It conveyed human witnessing of human courage. "Mr. Judge Harrison said, her voice carrying a note of warning, I suggest you reconsider your approach with this witness." Opened his mouth, then closed it. He tried again, launching into another series of aggressive questions, but something had fundamentally shifted. The jury was no longer viewing Emma as a potentially unreliable child. They were viewing her as a brave survivor who had faced her own trauma to seek justice. Every question asked now seemed to rebound against him, each aggressive probe making him appear more like a bully and less like a legitimate legal representative. Emma's testimony continued for another hour, and with each answer, her confidence. She described details with the crystalline precision of someone who had witnessed something so traumatic that it had burned itself into her consciousness with photographic clarity. She described what the victim looked like, the sounds she'd heard, the timeline, the weather, the clothes, every detail that her young but extraordinarily observant mind had captured. And through it all, Max remained beside her, silent, steady, absolutely present. When finally said, "No further questions," and Emma was dismissed, Judge Harrison made a note on her legal pad with such intensity that her pen nearly tore through the paper. Her expression had fundamentally changed. She was no longer a judge presiding over a case. She was a witness to something that had moved her at the deepest human level, and that witnessing would fundamentally alter how she viewed justice itself. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 23 minutes. In a normal case involving a crime of this severity, with the amount of corroborating evidence the prosecution had presented, deliberations often stretched into days. But this jury had witnessed something extraordinary, something that had clarified their moral imperative with stunning simplicity. A child had found the courage to speak truth, and that truth had reverberated through the courtroom with unmistakable force. Emma sat in the hallway with Officer Martinez and Max, her mother beside her, as they waited for the jury's return. The prosecutor had suggested they wait in a private witness room, but Emma had quietly requested to stay near Max, had simply nodded her permission, understanding that her daughter had learned something profound about where safety actually lived, not in isolation, but in connection. Officer Martinez reviewed case details on his tablet, but his primary focus remained on Emma. The child sat with her hand buried in Max's fur, the dog positioned with his back against her legs, as if creating a living barrier between Emma and the chaos of the courthouse. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The language between them had evolved beyond words into something more fundamental, a conversation of presence and loyalty and unwavering commitment. Studied her daughter, trying to reconcile this child with the terrified, mute version from 6 months ago. Something had broken open inside Emma during testimony, but it wasn't her spirit. It was something else, perhaps the shell of shame and terror that trauma had constructed, finally cracking under the weight of speaking truth aloud. Emma said softly, reaching over to stroke her daughter's hair. Whatever happens when they come back, I want you to know how incredibly proud I am of you. You were so brave in there. Emma leaned into her mother's touch, still not speaking, but the silence now was different. It wasn't the silence of trauma. It was the silence of someone who was simply quiet by choice, resting in the shelter of people who loved her. The bailiff appeared in the doorway. They have a verdict. Emma's body went rigid. Officer Martinez immediately stood, and Max rose with fluid grace, shaking himself as if preparing for what came next. The walk back into the courtroom felt different this time, less like walking toward an executioner and more like walking toward a resolution, toward an ending, toward whatever came next. The courtroom was packed now. The media had caught wind that a verdict was imminent, and every seat in the gallery was occupied. Cameras pointed from the back. Journalists whispered urgently into their phones. The atmosphere crackled with the kind of tension that came only when a community understood it was about to witness justice delivered. Emma took her position at the front, with Max beside her. The defendant, Robert, sat at the defense table in his expensive suit, his attorney beside him. Something in his expression had shifted since Emma's testimony, a tightness around his eyes, a grayness to his complexion that suggested the full weight of his actions had finally become impossible to deny. Judge Harrison entered from her chambers and took her seat on the bench. The jury is returning. Let us have order in the courtroom. The 12 jurors filed in solemnly. Their faces revealed nothing, following the strict jury instruction not to display emotion. But Emma had learned to read subtle signals over the past 6 months, the tightness of lips, the way eyes wouldn't meet certain people's gaze. These jurors would not meet Robert's eyes. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Harrison asked. The foreman, the middle-aged man who'd watched Emma with such protective intensity during her testimony, stood. He was holding the verdict form, his hands steady but his jaw working slightly. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of aggravated child abuse, how do you find the defendant? Guilty, the foreman said, his voice carrying the weight of moral certainty. Emma felt Max's body stiffen beside her, as if the dog understood the significance of the word. She felt her mother's hand grip her shoulder from the gallery behind her. She felt something inside her, a knot she'd been carrying since that night 6 months ago, finally begin to loosen. On the charge of sexual assault of a minor, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. On the charge of unlawful transportation of a minor across state lines for purposes of exploitation, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. On the charge of attempted murder, how do you find the defendant? The pause before the fourth guilty verdict seemed to stretch into eternity. Emma's 7-year-old mind didn't fully understand all the legal terminology, but she understood this. The man who had shattered her world, who had made her afraid to speak, who had invaded her nightmares for half a year, had been found guilty. Justice, it seemed, was real. The gallery erupted into sounds of relief and validation. Judge Harrison gavelled for order, and the courtroom quieted immediately. Bailiffs approached the defense table, and Robert was placed under arrest by officers who'd been standing at the ready. His attorney was already gathering his briefcase, his expression suggesting he'd anticipated this outcome, and was preparing to distance himself from a client whose crimes had been laid bare by a 7-year-old's testimony. His eyes found Emma as he was led away. For a moment, their gazes locked. He tried to stare her down, tried to reclaim some sense of dominance or power. But Emma stood with Max beside her, her hand buried in his fur, her voice having finally been heard. The predator's stare had no power over her anymore. Judge Harrison waited until had been removed from the courtroom before she removed her reading glasses and addressed the court. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion that she made no attempt to hide. "This case has taught me something I should have understood decades ago," she began, her gaze finding Emma. "We have long believed that the pursuit of justice required witnesses to be strong in traditional ways, unafraid, articulate, emotionally untouched by what they'd witnessed. But what we witnessed today was a different kind of strength entirely. A child, traumatized beyond measure, found the courage to speak truth because she was not alone. She was supported. She was believed. And that, I think, is the future of our legal system." She turned to Officer Martinez. "The court commends the department's trauma-informed approach to this case. This courtroom will be implementing a formal program for future cases." Then, still looking at Emma, "And this young girl has proven that the most powerful weapon in the pursuit of justice isn't aggression or intimidation. It's compassion, it's witnessing. It's standing beside someone who's suffered and saying, 'I believe you, your voice matters, your pain will be answered with justice.'" Judge Harrison's words hung in the courtroom air like something sacred. The jury members were visibly moved, several nodding with clear agreement. The prosecutors looked validated. The media began recording, already understanding that this verdict represented something that transcended a single case. Emma felt Max lean against her leg, and she understood that what they had created together, this child and this dog, this witness and this witness bearer, had opened something in the legal system that had been closed for too long. They had changed the conversation about how trauma survivors should be treated. They had transformed what it meant to seek justice. Her voice, once stolen by fear, had become a force for systemic change. And she was only 7 years old. The story broke nationally within 48 hours. 7-year-old's testimony, convict's predator, accompanied by police dog, child finds voice in trauma, the headlines declared. News outlets that typically focused on celebrity scandals and political drama suddenly pivoted to focus on a case that resonated with something deeper, a story about childhood vulnerability, courage, and the profound difference that compassion could make in the pursuit of justice. The video of Emma's testimony went viral, accumulating 12 million views within the first week. But it wasn't the sensational aspects of the crime that captured public imagination. It was the moment when Judge Harrison removed her glasses and wept while speaking about redefining strength. It was the image of Max positioned protectively beside Emma in the witness stand. It was the transformation of a traumatized child into a powerful voice for truth. Within 2 weeks, Judge Harrison's office received calls from courthouses across the country. Legal institutions that had never considered trauma-informed approaches were suddenly scrambling to understand what had happened in Courtroom 7. Defense attorneys who'd once scoffed at therapeutic animals as emotional manipulation began researching their actual effectiveness. Law schools invited Judge Harrison to speak about the case in their evidence and trial procedure courses. The American Bar Association issued a statement within a month. The conviction in the case demonstrates that supporting vulnerable witnesses through trauma-informed approaches strengthens rather than weakens the legal system. We recommend all jurisdictions examine similar protocols. Officer Martinez received invitations to speak at legal conferences, law enforcement training programs, and judicial seminars across the country. He'd been invited to present at the National Association of District Attorneys, the Federal Judicial Conference, and the American Psychological Association's annual convention. What had started as a local police department program was rapidly becoming a national model for trauma-informed justice. But the most significant change happened quietly, in courthouses across America, where other traumatized witnesses, children and adults alike, began to receive similar considerations. A courthouse in Colorado implemented a trauma support animal program based directly on what had happened in Emma's case. Within 6 months, they'd successfully prosecuted 3 cases that previously would have resulted in acquittals because witnesses were too traumatized to testify effectively. A courthouse in New York created a specialized, trauma-informed witness protocol that included not just animals, but trained psychological support persons. A courthouse in Texas began requiring defense attorneys to take courses on trauma's impact on memory and testimony before they could cross-examine vulnerable witnesses. The legal profession itself began shifting its understanding of what constituted effective justice. Defense attorneys who'd built entire careers on aggressive cross-examination tactics suddenly found juries unreceptive to attacks on traumatized witnesses. Judges began issuing firm guidance. Vigorous cross-examination is a constitutional right, but brutal interrogation of trauma survivors will not be permitted in this courtroom. The adversarial nature of the legal system remained unchanged, but the methods by which was pursued began to evolve. Emma's case became a teaching tool in law schools across the nation. Professor Holmes at Georgetown Law School developed an entire course around the case, examining how institutional systems could be restructured to support vulnerable populations. Her students studied the precedent-setting nature of Judge Harrison's decision, the precedent it created, and the broader implications for how trauma survivors engaged with legal systems. Academic papers proliferated. Therapeutic Justice and the Case, Redefining Witness Support in American Courtrooms, was published in the Yale Law Review. The Neurobiology of Trauma, Why Children Need Support Animals in High-Stress Legal Proceedings, appeared in the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology. Compassion as a Legal Strategy, How Emma's Testimony Changed American Justice, was featured in the American Journal of Trial Advocacy. But beyond the professional impact, something more profound was happening in communities across the country. Other traumatized children began coming forward to testify against abusers. Police departments created their own trauma support animal programs. Courthouses began investing in child-friendly witness rooms and trauma-informed training for all court personnel. Victims' advocacy groups received increased funding because suddenly, the legal system had publicly acknowledged that supporting vulnerable witnesses wasn't bias, it was justice. 6 months after the verdict, Officer Martinez received a call from Sarah Mitchell, a prosecutor in Kansas City. She was working with an 8-year-old girl who'd witnessed her father's abuse of her younger brother. The girl had been refusing to testify, terrified of the courtroom process and of confronting her father. Sarah had read about Max and Emma and wanted to know if Officer Martinez's program had resources they could access. "We can help," Officer Martinez told her, "and we're not alone anymore. There are K-9 departments in 12 states that have now established similar programs. There's a national network forming." He put Sarah in touch with Officer James in Los Angeles, who'd started a trauma support animal program that had already helped 23 vulnerable witnesses. Officer connected her with Officer in Chicago, whose program worked with adult survivors of sexual assault. Within weeks, Sarah Mitchell had resources and support and best practices to draw from, a network that hadn't existed before Emma's case. The little girl in Kansas City with a golden retriever at her side and her father was convicted on multiple counts of child abuse. Like Emma, this child's voice had been supported by something more than protocol. It had been held by compassion. The ripple effect continued. A courthouse in Phoenix implemented a specialized judicial training program focused on trauma-informed justice. A courthouse in Atlanta created a position specifically dedicated to victim support and witness protection. Universities began offering graduate degrees in trauma-informed legal practice. Medical schools started including training on how to identify and support trauma survivors who might be navigating legal proceedings. But perhaps most significantly, the conversation in American courtrooms fundamentally shifted. Judges began asking not, how do we ensure the defendant gets a fair trial, but rather, how do we ensure that all participants in this legal proceeding, including vulnerable witnesses, can participate authentically and effectively? These weren't opposing goals. They were complementary. A system that supported witnesses in speaking honestly and clearly produced more accurate verdicts, which served justice for everyone. Emma's case became a citation in legal briefs arguing for trauma-informed reforms. As established in v. Judges wrote, referencing the precedent that had been set, defense attorneys who once would have fought tooth and nail against support animals in witness stands now simply accepted them as part of the evolving legal landscape. Officer Martinez stood on the stage of the National Judicial Conference, looking out at 300 judges from across the country, with Max sitting at attention beside him. Behind him, a screen displayed photographs from Emma's testimony, the child in the witness stand, the dog beside her, Judge Harrison's tears. "This isn't just about one child in one case," Officer Martinez said, his voice steady and passionate. "This is about recognizing that seeking justice doesn't require destroying the people who've been traumatized by crime. This is about understanding that strength and vulnerability aren't opposites. This is about building a legal system that actually serves justice, not just wins cases, but honors the humanity of everyone involved, especially the most vulnerable among us." The applause that followed was sustained, emotional, and united in a way that rarely happened in the adversarial world of law and litigation. Emma, in her elementary school classroom far away, had no idea how many lives her courage was touching. She didn't know that a judge in Florida had just authorized a trauma support animal program based on her testimony. She didn't know that a prosecutor in Michigan had just referenced her case in arguing for witness protection reforms. She didn't know that across America, children were finding their voices because one 7-year-old girl had found hers. She just knew that when she visited Max at the police station on weekends, the dog seemed to know exactly when she needed to be held, and that was enough. 8 months had passed since the day Emma found her voice, and the world looked entirely different from where she stood. The community center was decorated with banner streamers and silver balloons. A temporary stage had been erected at one end of the gymnasium, with a podium positioned prominently and folding chairs arranged in neat rows for dignitaries and press. Local politicians stood in small clusters, speaking earnestly to journalists who were documenting what had been termed a historic recognition of child advocacy and trauma-informed justice. But Emma barely noticed any of that. She was focused entirely on the small tiara the volunteer had placed on her head and the shimmering blue dress her mother had helped her select. She'd insisted on wearing princess shoes, white ones with small heels, and her mother had agreed without hesitation. This was Emma's day. Emma got to choose. Stood beside her daughter in the green room adjacent to the gymnasium, tears already streaming down her face though the ceremony hadn't begun. She'd been crying easily lately, not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief and joy. Her daughter had come back to her, not immediately, not all at once, but in gradual waves of healing that now felt almost complete. "You're going to do great out there, baby," said, smoothing down Emma's hair. "Just like you've done great at everything since that day in court." Emma smiled, something she did frequently now, something that had returned to her face gradually as the months passed. Her smile was still sometimes tinged with awareness of what she'd endured, but it was genuine, real, hard-won but authentic. The past 8 months had been a journey of reclamation. The selective mutism had lifted within weeks of her testimony. At first, Emma had spoken only in single sentences, her voice still tentative and testing the waters of safety. But gradually the words had returned. Full sentences, stories, laughter. She'd returned to school after a 2-month absence, and while other children had approached her with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty, Emma had discovered that she was no longer afraid to be herself around them. She joined an after-school art program and discovered a passion for painting. She'd learned to ride a bicycle without training wheels. She'd started taking piano lessons and had performed in a recital in front of an audience without a single moment of panic. Her therapist, Dr. Reeves, had gradually reduced their sessions from twice weekly to once monthly as Emma's anxiety markers continued to decline. And then there was hope. 2 months ago, Emma's parents had surprised her with a golden retriever puppy. The timing had felt significant. Emma, naming her Hope, was almost a natural extension of her own internal transformation. The puppy had become Emma's constant companion, a living embodiment of what she'd learned through Max. That connection with another being could heal wounds that seemed impossible to survive. Emma had even started a small support group at school for kids who'd experienced trauma. With Dr. Reeves' guidance and her parents' encouragement, she'd begun speaking at assemblies about the importance of telling trusted adults when something was wrong. Her message was simple but powerful. You are not alone. Your voice matters. It's okay to be scared, but it's better to speak up. Children listened to Emma in a way they listened to few adults. There was something about her willingness to speak about her own terror, her own struggle with silence, her own journey toward finding her voice that resonated in their bones. Parents who attended these presentations often wept. Teachers reported increased disclosures from students who'd experienced abuse, children finally finding courage because they'd heard Emma's story. The gymnasium doors opened, and Emma was guided toward the stage. The audience, perhaps 200 people, included judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, police officers, child advocacy experts, and community members. In the front row, Officer Martinez sat with Max beside him, the dog in full dress harness with a special medal already attached to his collar. Max's eyes tracked Emma's movement the moment she appeared, and his tail began to wag with recognition and pride. Judge Harrison sat prominently, next to the mayor, who would be presenting the award. The mayor stepped to the podium and began speaking about community heroes, about courage in unexpected places, about the transformative power of speaking truth. Emma barely heard the words. She was focused on Officer Martinez and Max, drawing strength from their steady presence the way she had in that courthouse hallway 8 months ago. Our first honoree today is someone who has changed not just this community, but our entire legal system, the mayor was saying. Her courage in speaking her truth has resulted in the establishment of trauma-informed justice programs across the nation. She has shown us that the strongest among us are sometimes the most vulnerable. Please join me in welcoming to the stage, Emma. Emma walked forward, still small, still young, but carrying herself with a quiet confidence that hadn't existed 8 months ago. She stepped to the podium and the audience fell silent, waiting to hear what this remarkable child had to say. "Thank you," Emma began, her voice clear and audible throughout the gymnasium. "I want to thank Officer Martinez and Max, because without them, I don't know if I ever would have found my voice." She paused, looking directly at the dog who'd given her so much. "A long time ago, something really bad happened to me, and it made me so scared that I stopped talking. I thought if I didn't talk about it, maybe I could forget about it, but I couldn't forget. The scared feelings were still there. They were just hiding inside me." Emma's voice wavered slightly, but she continued. "I was so alone in my scared feelings. I thought nobody would believe me. I thought it was my fault. I thought a lot of things that weren't true, but then Max came and he showed me something really important. She looked at the dog and Max's tail thumped against the floor. Max showed me that I didn't have to be alone. He showed me that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means talking about the scared things even when you want to hide. And when you do that, when you're really, really brave and you tell the truth, people listen. And justice happens. His hands were covering her mouth, tears streaming freely. Around the gymnasium, people were visibly moved, several wiping their own eyes. I have something to say to other kids who have been hurt or scared or who have seen something bad happen, Emma said, her voice growing stronger. Your voice matters, even if you're small, even if you're only 7 years old. Your words have power. The truth has power. And there are people who will believe you and help you. You don't have to be alone. The audience erupted into applause. Emma stepped back as the mayor presented her with a plaque recognizing her as Youth Hero of the Year. Then Officer Martinez stood and guided Max to the stage, where the dog received his own recognition, Police Service Animal of Exceptional Merit. When the ceremony concluded, Emma rushed down from the stage and threw her arms around Max's neck. The dog pressed his head against her chest, and Officer Martinez placed his hand on Emma's shoulder with the kind of gentle understanding that only came from witnessing true transformation. You did amazing out there, Emma, Officer Martinez said. Max is so proud of you. Emma looked up at him and then smiled, not the tentative smile of 8 months ago, but a genuine, full smile that reached her eyes. Max taught me how to do it. He taught me that having someone beside you makes everything possible. Later that evening, as Emma sat in her backyard with Hope curled against her side and Mr. Whiskers positioned nearby, the stuffed rabbit had been retired but not abandoned. She looked up at the stars and thought about everything that had changed. The nightmares had mostly stopped. The hypervigilance had faded. The weight she'd been carrying had finally been set down. She'd been broken and the breaking had been devastating. But in being broken, she discovered something that people didn't discover unless they were forced to. That the human spirit is remarkably resilient. That voice, once found, is powerful, and that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the most unexpected sources. A girl, a dog, and the courage to speak the truth. That was all it had taken to change everything. And she was only 8 years old.